Hello, I'm Helen Adams. I'm a senior lecturer in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in the geography department at King's College London. I look at climate change migration. I look at the reasons why people stay despite climate risk, and I'm really at the moment trying to investigate how we can help people to stay in places they love and help those places to thrive, even despite climate change. I thought I was a physical scientist, so I did natural sciences as my undergraduate degree. I did really well. I went straight to the UN Climate Change Convention and I worked at the OECD in their climate change team. Everybody whose job I wanted had a PhD. My boss was like, Helen, you need to get a PhD. And so I actually left thinking I would return to the UN and take up a career there. As it turned out, as I was finishing my PhD, my boss wrote me into the way it works is you apply for a grant, you can write people into a grant. If you get the grant, I then had a job, and because I was so busy finishing my PhD, I didn't have time to think about what job I was going to take up, so I ended up doing a postdoc. So I was incredibly lucky because a lot of people apply for postdocs and they only get a 1-year one or a 2-year one or a 9-month one. I got a 4-year postdoc after finishing my PhD, and that kind of cemented it. KCL has a really strong centre in climate change and disaster risk reduction and resilience, adaptation. So that's what brought me there. There was a big research team of people working around resilience and climate change, and that's what I did my PhD in. So a job came up, a lectureship, and I applied for it, and that was now 8 years ago. So what I do writ large is climate change adaptation. So how we as humans, society, I don't want to use the word adapt, so change in order that the impacts of climate change don't affect us. Specifically, I look at migration. I look at human migration and whether the ways in which people will respond to the impacts of climate change. And I think throughout that is this sense of how do we maintain human rights, how do we maintain people's well-being when people move because of climate change. There's a big element of kind of social justice in there. But specifically, I look at why people stay. There'd been a big kind of finding that people might not move, they might be trapped. So, you know, you think about Hurricane Katrina, there was all those people who were trapped on their roofs or with their pets, or they didn't have cars and they couldn't leave. And so there's this idea that actually a lot of people might want to move, but they can't. So then I kind of nuanced that a bit and said, actually, there's a lot of people who might want to leave, but not enough, or the impacts of climate change aren't as bad as leaving the place where they live would be. So I come from this idea of emotional bonds to place. That kind of drives what I look at. And also the kind of non-material elements of our decision making. So much is about, I mean, it makes sense. So much of what we do is about jobs and money and, you know, but so many of the decisions we make aren't economically rational, right? They're about our mother-in-laws or memories of our family or, you know, and a fear of crime or whatever. And I like to try and bring those concepts into how we think about people under climate change. So at the moment, I've slightly moved, I suppose, away from the migration idea. But it's the same theme, because what really interests me is why places persist. And that was, you know, why is it that some place, random place you don't expect to be still going under climate change is still going? And I kind of look at that from the idea that certain people, that's their home. But now I'm kind of taking that forward and thinking, okay, how do we help places persist? So in the Global South, particularly, there is a trend towards cities. So a lot of people, I mean, that's driven by economic processes, but I think exacerbated by climate change, because if you think in the countryside, everybody's incomes are developed, well, not everybody, but lots of people's incomes are climate sensitive, agriculture. But how do you make these rural towns that have been left behind by economic processes, how do you make them resilient to climate change, but actually not only that, thrive under climate change, right? And so for me, a lot of what I'm doing at the moment is how do we bring out the positives of action under climate change? How do we help people see that a climate change future doesn't necessarily have to be a bad one? There's nothing apocalyptic about it. There's nothing even that negative about it, because basically a lot of the reasons why all our lives are a bit rubbish has got nothing to do with the climate. It's got to do with the way we structure society, inequality. So if we can deal with those issues, then we can deal, well, climate change becomes less of an issue. Within that broad kind of framing, there is this sense that actually living under climate change is going to involve, for me, two things that I'm thinking about at the moment. Living with more the threat of hazards. So, you know, if I want to stay living on the coast, there are going to be more coastal floods, and we are going to lose stuff. So places we love, plant species we like, landscapes we know, ways of life are going to disappear, and how do we help people deal with that loss? And so really what I'm thinking about at the moment is how do we help people live with those things in a way that, to use a, well, in a way that is emancipatory. You know, how does it help people actually feel empowered through that loss and that living with risk? I haven't got the answers, but that's what I'm looking at. How's my research developed? It's become a lot more qualitative because I started with a natural sciences degree. Yeah, it was, I was sort of stats based in the beginning, very quantitative social surveys. And I still have, you know, I'm interested in social surveys and the kind of answers that quantitative approaches can give us. But obviously if you look at emotions, you know, that obviously lends itself, well maybe not obviously, but it lends itself to a qualitative approach. And so that's a clear transition in my work. Another one which I think a lot of us in adaptation have sort of moved towards is more of a solutions focus. So I think a movement towards solutions and towards working with the people who can implement those solutions, you know, that's been a sort of trend. You know, how do we actually do something about this? You know, we know what's going to happen, we know what we need to do in terms of adaptation. How do we do it? And I think a big trend towards social justice, environmental justice. Climate change is the biggest opportunity we've had, really, to right some of the wrongs in the world, to redress some of the imbalances. And how do you try and enable that? We're moving towards that. We're moving towards what more equitable research practices would look like. But I think that's a challenge because the funding's in the global north. But also the funders are moving towards, you know, funds can go to partners in the global south. They want you to co-produce work. So a lot of our challenge now is, if we're designing a research project, how do we design it in a way that it is actually co-produced with the people that we're working with, not working on? Adaptation to climate change as a field is quite closely aligned to development. I think migration found me. I've always cared about climate change. I've always cared about climate change since I was a teenager, and it's the only thing I've ever wanted to work in from this worry, you know. Adaptation to climate change came just because I was applying for job opportunities and internships, and I ended up in adaptation. I didn't even know it was a thing, you know, when I was in my teens. I think the social justice element, the more you are in climate change, the more you realise it's not an environmental fight. The fight against climate change is a fight against the way we structure our economy. It's a fight against, you know, the richest people who are using the most resources. And so I just don't think you can be in it without moving towards more of those equity and justice concerns. They just come at you so fully. Yeah, so it sort of finds you and grabs you. But I also just don't think, there's no right thing. I didn't choose what I studied, right? I wanted to do a PhD, I did it, and it found me. And so I think, don't worry too much about needing to be passionate about something before you start, because you'll find what it is in that drives you afterwards.